Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome now to our second panel. This whole day, as you know, is a celebration of the 50th anniversary of our College of Liberal Arts, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel on Purdue at the Intersection. I'm Jay McCann. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at Purdue, and I'm looking forward to an engaging conversation with our panelists. By way of sort of framing this session, I thought I'd begin with an observation. Many of you, I trust, have had an opportunity to visit some of the great university campuses around the world, Oxford, Cambridge, or some of the traditional campuses, the pre-revolutionary campuses here in the United States. What you see are kind of walls of some kind or another. Campuses were meant to be an enclave. Colleges, I'm thinking I spent some time at Oxford when I was an undergraduate, and I remember each of the colleges had its own little boundary. In some cases, there were sentry posts and so on. You had to check in and check out. And there was this real tradition of separation, college against college, town against gown. And okay, the days when that was really needed, those days are long past gone, okay? But I think the way academics is sometimes practiced, we have this sort of walled mentality about us, or we live in these silos or these little enclaves. And that's a sort of necessary part of the job in our research and in our teaching and in our curriculum, right? Most of us come from certain disciplines, but the reality is life is so much better when you can get out of that silo and tear down those walls. And so that's the genesis of this panel here. We're going to be talking about well, this is just a sampling, a nice sampling of all the different initiatives going on in the College of Liberal Arts, where the walls have come down, where productive collaborations have ensued with different partners all around the campus and out in the general community. So it's a real treat for me to moderate this discussion. Let me just say that I'm an empirical social scientist, which means anybody standing up making a claim about walls coming down or life is better if you're getting outside of your box, well, you need some evidence for that. So what you're going to hear is some evidence presented from 5 very distinguished colleagues. I'll give you some introductory remarks, and then we'll just let them take it from there. And I'll just go kind of boom, boom, boom down the line here. Seated right here on my left is Felicia Roberts. She's a professor in the Brian Lamb School of Communication. She also is the director of Purdue's interdisciplinary program on linguistics. Professor Roberts is an internationally recognized scholar known for her expertise in the study of human communication and the methods for studying naturally occurring conversation. She has been invited to present her work on the dynamics of conversation and moments of pausing at several major European universities. And for over 2 decades, she's worked at the intersection of linguistics and health, particularly in the context of important areas: HIV counseling, primary care practice, and veterinary medicine. Okay, seated next to Felicia is Professor Daniel Aldrich. Daniel is a colleague of mine in the Department of Political Science. He's a leading expert on how communities recover from natural disasters, such as Hurricane Katrina, an experience that he had firsthand, an event he experienced firsthand, I should say. And he also investigates recovery following man-made disasters or mishaps, such as the catastrophic nuclear failure at Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan 3 years ago. Professor Aldrich has conducted extensive field work in Japan, India, France, and the United States, among other places. He's been a visiting scholar at the Japanese Ministry of Finance, the Institute for Social Sciences at Tokyo University, Harvard University, and several other institutions. Going down the line is Kory Cooper. He's a professor in the Department of Anthropology and holds an appointment in materials engineering. He's originally from Missouri, but he's been all over the place. He spent time in Jordan doing research on metal artifacts from the Roman Byzantine period tombs. His most current work extends his doctoral research on the use of native copper in Alaska and the Yukon area. These activities are supported by the Arctic Social Science Division of the U.S. National Science Foundation. Moving on is Dr. Tina Rulli, she's a professor in the Department of Philosophy. Her work focuses primarily on moral considerations in medical decision-making and healthcare, among other contexts. Prior to coming to Purdue, she held a 2-year postdoc in the Clinical Center Bioethics Department at the National Institutes of Health. There she worked with an interdisciplinary group of scholars in bioethics that included professionals from the fields of law, medicine, public health, and philosophy. And one of the recurring themes in her research and teaching is the notion that scientific and medical procedures are not value neutral. Scientists necessarily have to wrestle with questions of good versus bad, right versus wrong in their daily lives. And she is going to explain how philosophy has so much to contribute to this kind of wrestling. And then on the end is Professor Rick Thomas. He's in the visual and performing arts part of our college. Professor Thomas wears many hats. He's a composer, a sound designer, a playmaker, an author, an educator. I just discovered that he actually came to campus in 1976, so he's seen a lot, and there aren't too many positions on campus that he hasn't held so far. He's composed scores and designed sound for over 100 productions, including the Hong Kong Repertory Theater, the Dublin Theater Festival, the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, which I have attended, and ESP Television, which I watch all the time, among other things, okay? He has written extensively about the art and practice of theater sound and is a fellow of the United States Institute for Theater Technology, where he was honored with the Founders Award in 2008. Professor Thomas is also an elected member of the National Theater Conference. He's lectured all around the world, Germany, the United Arab Emirates, Korea, and New York City at the Broadway Sound Master Classes. So we've got a terrific panel lined up. Our conversation about Purdue at the Intersection will be rather informal. Okay, I'll invite each of our panelists to discuss some of the questions that they find most exciting and how they integrate their research into the classroom and other such topics. To get the ball rolling, why don't I start with Rick Thomas. Rick, tell us about your field of sound design and engineering and the connections you've made across our campus over the years.
Well, it's a pretty interesting story, at least to me, going back to you. I got a position, I won't go into that whole story, in sound as an undergraduate and had an undergraduate assistantship. And as my career as an undergraduate came to an end, I started realizing that I needed to go to grad school primarily to learn how to stop blowing up things. And so when I looked around at grad programs, Purdue sort of stood out because, well, it's this fine engineering school, this fine technology school. I'll be able to go right in there, take some classes, I'll figure all this stuff out, and I will be, I'll be marketable. So I got recruited to Purdue. I got an assistantship, a graduate assistantship in the theater department, and I came over here, and hokey smokes, there seemed like there was nothing. There were no classes in theater and sound and audio technology and all the stuff I started to need. So, I went to my major professor, Van Phillips, who still is in town here. Many of you probably know of Van. And he sort of pointed me in a couple different directions, and off I went. So I went over to WBAA and bothered some people there and met the chief engineer there who took me under his wing. And the Mitch album book, Tuesdays with Morris. I had Tuesdays with Morris now since, because that's his name, Maury Mogridge. I've had Tuesdays with Morris now for like over 40 years, something like that. And he still mentors me in all the arts of audio engineering. And I went over to the comm department and I met Dick Forsyth, who was teaching a class, and then it turned out he didn't want to teach it anymore. And so he turned it over to me, and suddenly I was teaching radio production. I remember Dave Berg came up to me and said, "Have you ever worked in a radio station?" I said, "Of course I have." And I didn't tell him it was a dorm radio station, and he didn't ask, because they needed somebody and I needed a job, I went over to the physics department and met Harold Tubus, and he was teaching a class in the physics of musical sound. Well, I never had calculus, and so he put me in this physics 470A class, and he got those. Remember those old overhead projectors, and he would just roll them up, and on the screen would just be one long calculus equation that lasted the entire class. And I would get my friends to sort of tutor me in calculus. And this was like senior level calculus. Nobody understood. Even my friends didn't understand the calculus either. But I got an A in the class because once I understood what the equations were describing, I knew what it meant. And I had an advantage over the students, the physics students, because they didn't know what it meant. They only knew what the equations were. And they only knew how to work the equations. But they didn't know if they had a right or wrong answer. So it's a great example, of where the liberal arts come in handy for people if you know what the data means. It's one thing to generate data. I went over to School of Electrical and Computer Engineering Technology, and because I needed to take some class, I met Gil Raymer over there, and he sent me down to their shop, and they had me fix things, and they were going to have me fix this little cassette deck, and before you know it, I walked out of there because I couldn't fix it. And I was so embarrassed. Here, I'm a sound guy, and I can't fix a cassette recorder. But eventually, I got a job with the audiovisual department, and the guy who was running the shop went over to Saudi Arabia because he had an opportunity there, and he said, "Do you want to run the shop while I'm gone?" He was going to be gone for 2 years, and I said, "Sure, why not?" Everybody in the shop was like 65, 75 years old, and I mean, they were, really on the verge of retirement, so there was really nothing I was going to teach them. They were actually teaching me, and I was doing all the paperwork. But I learned a lot, by going over there. I went over to the Hall of Music and became a stagehand over there and learned a ton, just by getting in that environment. I went over to Herrick Labs and wandered around there, and I met Stuart Bolton and Patricia, who runs Herrick Labs, and we are still friends to this day. And I wanted, for my graduate thesis, this is really funny, I wanted to study psychoacoustics. So I went over to the audiology department and met with the people there, and then I very quickly found out that at the graduate level, studying psychoacoustics means you spend your life going, is it louder in your left ear or is it louder in your right ear? No, that's not what I want to do. I want to figure out how the human mind interprets sound and music and then use that to manipulate people in the theater. And they're like, you got to start more basic than that. So, the long and the short of it was I discovered just by wandering around this university that everything in the university applied to what I did. And I was glad to be in a place called a university. And that's how my career got started.
That's a great story. And I think you have enough institutional memory for, 5 people. This is great.
If all state, I would.
Well, let me bounce around a little bit. Felicia Roberts, how does a linguist, end up working in medical settings? Tell us about that, and how did you make that transition?
Right. So, well, sort of like Rick is saying that sound is everywhere. It's part of any discipline or any matter that you could think of. In the same way, really, language and the study of language, and especially human communication, is relevant in all domains. And for me, the way that I got really into kind of the health aspect of it was that as a graduate student, I was at the University of Wisconsin. I was a TA, like many graduate students are. I was teaching English as a second language. But I also supplemented my income by working for an epidemiologist. And she had a multi-site center studying risk factors for breast cancer. And my job mostly was to do a lot of interviewing of women about health history and so on. And this was a study that was, with Harvard School of Medicine and a site out in Seattle, and big multi-center study. And over the years, I worked for her, and I kind of moved up and learned more about the science of breast cancer, certainly, and breast cancer epidemiology. But also questions arose for me as someone who was studying language that were important about, how people go through the experience of recommendations, for example, for treatment. Because there was evidence in the epidemiologic literature that certain people got less aggressive treatments than others and so on. And this was usually treated in large-scale sort of survey studies, and I really wanted to look at, well, what actually happens during the office visit when physicians are interacting with their patients. And so that's kind of how it got started, and I began working then in the health context, specifically breast cancer for a while and on treatment recommendations, and kind of trying to learn about the science of it, as well as the sort of social science part of it, and interactions that way. And then once I got to Purdue, I had colleagues in the communication department that I worked with, specifically Mary Fran Madsen, who's now our department head. And we worked on some very interesting data that she had collected on HIV counseling. And we looked at deception and how counselors might advocate deception in certain ways in order to relate some news that they would need to tell. And then I also got connected up with the School of Veterinary Medicine, which was actually through a colleague in anthropology who introduced me to Alan Beck in the School of Veterinary Medicine. And I began working then about human-animal communication and how people send messages indirectly through their pets.
And those pets, they take long pauses,
Yeah.
too. She studies pauses, yes. Well, you mentioned deception.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I want to move then to Tina here. Tina Rulli, you look at medical ethics, okay, and you one of the things that really struck me, I read your bio and we've talked a bit. One of the things that struck me is you do a lot of kind of applied philosophy, applied ethics. You talk a lot with doctors and other medical staff and try to kind of help them frame things and raise questions. I wonder what you can tell us about stories from the field, or what's the hardest thing for you to teach a doctor or to clarify for a medical professional?
Oh, wow. So I did my graduate training in philosophical ethics, and so my background was really theoretical. I mean, I worked a bit on the applied side, but I really knew the theory. And then I got this postdoctoral fellowship at the National Institutes of Health, and there they have a bioethics center that's in the clinical center, which is one of the many institutes. And that clinical center is, one of the largest research hospitals. And so every patient enrolled there is enrolled in a clinical trial. And so you can imagine that the doctors, as investigators there, encounter ethics problems every single day. And so we actually, you imagine going from, theoretical training in ethics to running around with a pager and getting ethics calls, emergency calls. I'd be in the grocery store and, get a call from someone at such and such institute who has an ethics problem. And of course, I worked with a team, so this is good. They didn't put me just on the spot. But we as a team would then try to sit down and wrestle with these ethical issues. And I can't get into too many specifics because there's confidentiality, but they would range anywhere from, does this particular patient have capacity to consent to a somewhat risky research protocol, to we did a genetic screen to try and diagnose a disorder, and we found out along the way that this person is not genetically related to their parents, or do we disclose this kind of explosive information to a person, and what are the duties, what are the rights of people? And so you're saying, how do we teach doctors ethics? Our approach really was almost like ethics therapy. It was to sit down and work through the answers together, because it's not clear that we as ethicists knew the right answer either. We just knew a way to look at the issue and to maybe compare it to other cases. And so we were just trying to provide frameworks. And really, in the end, they would make the choice just as much as we were talking about this earlier, Jay, but as much as a patient might go to their doctor and ask for advice, the doctor is going to help put things in a framework, and then the patient makes a choice. We tried to offer the same service to doctors as ethicists.
No, it's interesting that the shoe is on the other foot then.
Right.
Yes. And maybe that might lead to Daniel Aldrich. You do, I know from your work, you do a similar sort of reframing or some translating. You do a lot of work with the policy community. You teach courses here in public policy, but you interact in very important contexts where lives are at stake with policymakers. I wonder if you could share some of your experiences. What is, I don't know, maybe the most important thing you've learned about the policymaking community, or maybe the biggest challenge you faced when you try to apply such a framework?
Yeah, the interesting challenge in 2 years ago, in 2011, 2012, to be in DC and work with the State Department there. And part of our job was to think about, how do you talk about policy changes to policymakers who have about 18 seconds of attention and very little interest in theory or how you got the decision. They want to know, what can we do and what are the costs to doing it? So my training had been about 500-page dissertations and very long-winded answers like I'm doing right now, and talking and talking. They wanted to hear, here's what you can do, here's some consequences, it'll cost you $2 million. So the dialogue that I had to start with myself, which is how do we communicate as political scientists? What do we think of ourselves as? Actually, there's a funny video that passed around recently about how long your dissertation is and how much you make afterwards. And all you can imagine the correlation was that the longer your dissertation, which way do you think it went? The less you made, right? Meaning business schools, for example, economics dissertations are very short. English, philosophy, history, political science tend to get a little longer. Anyway, that's a different discussion perhaps. But the idea of communicating in a way for policymakers meant short, discrete, and focused. And again, in a sense, devoid of theory. They didn't really want to hear why I thought it was there, what evidence I had. They wanted to see what could we do. And that really was a different way of thinking about a problem, as opposed to teaching through it, talking through it, and then working through it as a team.
Interesting. And then, Kory, I'd like to bring you in. One of your central focal points in your work, you look at natural copper and the use of copper metals in ancient societies. And you've done a lot of work in different locations examining how those uses play out. And I wonder, that has led, I know from conversations with you, that has led to a lot of other different kinds of projects. But when somebody asks you, why should somebody in engineering care about, archaeological digs and what is the basis of your connection cross campus? Because I know you have an appointment in materials engineering. How do you develop those connections, or how have the collaborations ensued?
Part of my success here at Purdue was finding the right materials engineer to talk to. And so, the relationship that I developed with Carol Handwerker, materials engineering, has been crucial. This is somebody that I'm working with in different kinds of contexts, different sorts of research. Archaeology is essentially a materials science because we have a very long-range view, a view with a lot of time depth of changes in technology and materials technology. So it may not be really important or valuable for engineers to know the details of the transition from using stone technology to other kinds of materials technologies, whether it's bone or metals, but the details may not be that important to them, but it's more the larger view of instances of innovation. And so I think it's not just, wow, this might be kind of neat to think about what people did in the past or gimmicky, but archaeologists, and I'm an archaeologist with degrees in anthropology, so archaeologists and anthropologists have quite a toolkit for examining change, changes going on now, change that occurred in the past, and a lot of it related to technology. If technology didn't change, there'd be nothing for archaeologists to study. But everything we do is based on changes in technology over time and space. So I think this time depth can be it can be beneficial. There's a lot of lessons you can learn in looking at different changes that have taken place in the recent and distant past. And again, anthropology with a holistic approach, you have changes in technology, but what was driving it, and then what were the consequences for these different changes? So now I'm involved with research looking at e-waste, for instance. And I'm just at the early stages of this, and I don't have anything to report on that. But there are no shortage of engineers who get it, who realize that it's not, in this case, archaeology and anthropology, but who understand that it's really important to understand the human behavior in examining technological change and trying to understand, perhaps anticipate different consequences that may not be obvious on the front end.
Interesting, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned your current project, because one of the things I wanted now, after having heard about some of your background, I'd like to hear about some of your projects on the horizon. One thing academics love is they love to think out loud. They love to talk about what's on the front burner and what they're thinking about, even though these are live microphones, and so we are sort of held accountable in some sense because this is being recorded. But academics, as a rule, love to just think out loud like that. So if I could hear a little bit more about the formative stage in your e-waste project, do you have particular questions you're pursuing about the generation of it or the way we treat it and things like that?
Yeah, that's so the materials engineering perspective. The immediate concern for engineers has to do with what are some possible replacement materials. But with all of these potential replacements for, well, I should back up, for harmful materials, may also have consequences. So for instance, a lot of people may not even know that their electronics went lead-free a few years ago, and this was driven by legislation in Europe that was mostly driven by public perceptions of the health risk associated with lead in the environment, which are real. Whether lead from electronics were really the problem is a separate issue, but there was legislation passed in Europe that electronics must go lead-free by a certain date. So manufacturers, they're not going to make two versions of the same product, one for sale in Europe and one in America. So they all started changing how they were making electronics, and that's actually my collaborator, Professor Handwerker. She was recruited, headhunted by Purdue because of her background at the National Institute of Standards in developing replacements for lead solders. So this is where you connect two components by melting some other material between them to connect them. So all of our electronic devices, this is very important, and you've got a lot of things sort of jammed into this small space. So the materials themselves, that's sort of the engineering problem. But again, you can come up with other replacements for lead, but some of these may also be harmful to people or the environment. And now we also have issues of conflict materials. So it's really important to understand where materials come from and where they're going to end up. And this is something archaeologists spend a lot of time thinking about. Engineers focus on life cycle analysis is very important. Archaeologists also do life cycle analysis, but we start from the end of the life cycle where things have been discarded, and then we try to figure out everything back to its creation. What's missing from the engineering perspective, or it's not really missing, it's just it's not their job, is the human component. So in the life cycle analysis, you got the raw materials, objects are made, then they're sold and used, and they're discarded and or recycled. So this whole area of sold and used is kind of a black box as far as they're concerned. And so I'm really interested in finding out more about that using anthropological kinds of archaeological perspectives, because archaeologists have developed, because we have tried to piece things together with only material objects in most cases. We've developed theoretical toolkits to try to understand the interaction between people and things.
Interesting. And maybe we can move to Daniel Aldrich. Daniel, I know since we're talking about sort of future projects, you mentioned that you have some collaborations that are getting developed right now and that will extend some of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I've been really lucky here at Purdue. I've been strongly encouraged to reach beyond political science and spend a lot of time in the engineering department now with several engineers over there, especially on issues of nuclear power and unwanted projects. So projects that might cause local backlash in their backyard. So an airport, for example, a dam. And we actually just published a paper in engineering journals, which is kind of cool, combining the methods that we use in political science with some of the engineering insights. And in that project, the first problem we had was having a language in common. The ways we approached the same problem was so different. And the engineers did see they call it human factors, right? This idea of the human part as sort of this side box that's there. And of course, in my mind, that's the entire problem, right? How local communities see the project is much more important than how it's built. So we actually published a paper recently in this journal that looked at how did local communities around the world, so for example, in Venezuela, in South Africa, and in China, see projects that were proposed by engineers. But we looked at the local perspective. How do local individuals deal with this proposal? Not from the technical perspective, is it made of concrete, is it made of steel or whatever, but the ways they saw the project, their risk perceptions, was it helpful to them, was it harming their livelihoods? So this has been a really interesting perspective, sort of this interaction with the engineers, learning from them how they see the project, but also giving them perhaps a new insight into this idea that these human factors are a bigger part of the project than just, those guys who live nearby.
Fascinating. Yeah, really important work. And just continuing on down the line, Felicia Roberts.
Yes.
Right there. I know you're also developing some projects
Right.
with colleagues across the disciplines.
Yeah. So
What do you have on the agenda here?
well, I guess so my work kind of always goes along two lines. So sort of like, I was thinking about this today really. If you think about physics, for example, since we're here talking about STEM, so you have kind of physicists who do basic work. They study particles and objects and how they move and so on. And so you have sort of basic scientists, and they're doing their work. And then you have applied physicists who are dealing with problems out in the world. I read something the other day about how Arnold Palmer was complaining that the golf balls go too fast now, so that they want to be able to slow down golf balls. Yeah.
Interesting.
They want to slow down golf balls. So that would be sort of a problem for an applied physicist or engineers and all that kind of thing. So you have this idea that you have sort of basic research about how objects move and shapes and so on, and then how you could apply that. Well, the same thing for someone who's in linguistics or communication. There's sort of basic research that we do, kind of fundamental work on basic particles of, say, language or speech, down to the level of sound, then up maybe into the level of word and then sentence and so on. So we have sort of basic research that we do. And then there's also applied research. And so the applied research might be you take some of those things that you learn about basics of language and you apply them, say, in teaching, for example, or in social problems, that kind of thing. So for me, my work does go along these two lines all of the time. So the basic research I'm working on, which relates to a kind of project bit out into the future. Actually, my part of the NSF proposal is due tomorrow. So anyway.
And doubly thank you for being here today.
So anyway, so I do this very basic work on silence and pauses in conversation. So silences at particular points in conversation, not just a silence at any old point, but a silence after somebody, for example, makes a request. So if I say, Jay, can you give me a ride to the store? And there's a little, long beat of silence there, maybe I'm worried, like, oh, Jay doesn't really want to go, or, hey, Jay, you want to go to the movies with me? Oh, you don't really want to go to the movies tonight, or you need to wash your hair, or something like that. So we know that these are problematic in everyday conversation, and they're problem at very specific points. So after requests, invitations, assessments, where you expect a response, what we call recipient design. So we expect that something's going to be forthcoming. So I've been doing a lot of basic experimental work on that to kind of, determine what's happening there. And then on the applied side, that work got picked up actually by people who are interested in issues, and these are not things I understand well because I'm looking around like hoping there's an engineer here. I'm not an engineer, but I'm working with engineers at University UT El Paso, although I need to connect with people here also. So the thing is that this work is about cell phone bandwidth and how you can economize on cell phone bandwidth by understanding what sort of conversation you're in by the structure of that conversation, because I study sort of structures of conversation. And so do you know, can you tell that you're in an emergency call, for example? Can you tell that you're in a friendly telephone call? Can you tell that you're in a doctor-patient interaction, advice-giving kind of call? So there are ways that we can do that. And issues of silence and pausing will be part of that, as well as just understanding the whole framework of the conversation. So we're collaborating to try to examine ways that you can use sort of the basic science of understanding language and how it works in everyday conversation, and apply that in mobile phone contexts and also video phone, because eye gaze is very important, and that can indicate when people are listening or not listening, and whether or not engineers would then allocate bandwidth, at certain points. Wow. So it's that's sort of out into the future. You said we wouldn't be held accountable.
No. That's a fascinating connection. I mean, the collaboration and what you're what you're contributing there. Well, let me ask a similar then kind of question to Tina Rulli. Moving forward, when you think about the kinds of research you're going to be doing, what kinds of cross-cutting collaborations do you envision?
So I still have a project that started when I was at the NIH, and there, we were in contact with many clinical investigators who were out in the world doing some sort of medical trial or drug trial, and they were oftentimes in low resource, low income settings, and they would encounter a lot of need and a lot of medical need that would go beyond the aims of their study. And so, in my work, I had worked on this moral duty known as the duty to rescue, and it will be familiar to all of you. It's just the basic idea that if someone is in great need and you can do something at little cost yourself to help them, then you have a moral duty to jump in and do so. And so we were trying to make sense of this duty to rescue, this sort of lofty idea, in the actual practical context for clinical researchers in low-income settings. And so, an example might be someone studying malaria sees many subjects who come in addition to having malaria, they also have schistosomiasis, a really devastating parasite. And so seems that duty to rescue says they ought to allocate some of their research funds to treating the schistosomiasis. But you can imagine that this compounds, because beyond that, they might have dental issues, they might have yeast infections, they might need antiretrovirals. And not only them, but the people that are just in the community but not in the trial. And so the question was sort of, when are you done for the day? When have you filled your quota of good? And this is what they came to us with, was can you help us? And it wasn't an abstract question, it was a gut question. It was, I think their hearts were hurting being in these settings and trying to figure out, when can they be done for the day? And so that's an ongoing research project right now, is trying to make sense of the role morality, the professional morals for clinical investigators in these contexts. So that's a research project. I just wanted to mention also that even before getting here, so when I was at the NIH, I was reached out to by Andrew Brightman, who's in biomedical engineering, and he has an NSF grant where they're working on developing computer-based technology to teach engineers ethics. And they're leveraging the already well-established biomedical ethics framework, known as principlism, it has 4 different principles, as the framework for engineering ethics. And so they're trying to take it past the engineering ethics right now, which is more or less a professional code to cover, for liability's sake, and really help engineers reason through ethical problems. And so they brought me on as a consultant for that project because I know the principlism framework. So that's kind of a nice example of the ways, someone working in ethics can jump over into the STEM fields and play a role.
No, fascinating work as well. And then Rick Thomas, what do you have on your sort of horizon here? What kinds of outreach are you doing? I know you do a lot of collaborating. What are you envisioning?
Well, first of all, I'm primarily and fundamentally an artist. So when we say research, for me it always winds up becoming, in some way, creative endeavor. But I actually have spent my entire life studying the role of music in theater. And I developed a course in it very early on in the late 1970s. And I still teach that course to this day, but as I've gone on in the sort of research I've done, it keeps expanding conceptually. And I finally, after many, many years, I don't know, in the last 5 or 10 years, have come to the conclusion that music is a primal force in theater, that you can have theater, you can have music without theater. You can go to a concert, but you can't have theater without music. When I say music, I mean in its widest sense, not just oral music, but music being defined in terms of rhythm and melody and those sorts of things. So it was even interesting hearing some of the conversation up here today when you were talking about soliciting a politician in Washington, and you have 18 seconds, and our linguistic friend over here would say it's a matter of the words and the words that you choose and choosing them correctly. And I, of course, immediately argue that it's a musical proposition. And when you gave your demonstration, you used 3 short phrases that were sort of equally spaced in a very musical manner, and you switched from the speaking melody that you're using in the audience today to a very different sort of musical composition when you had 18 seconds to communicate something to somebody. Because music is what commands our attention. Music is what keeps us involved in things. So that's led me into anthropology, studying, you have the origins of language. Where does language come from? There's big arguments that take place anthropologically about, does language come first? Did music just come along as sort of a free ride? But there's a lot of, music people who go not so quick. Music is fundamental. Philosophy, I've read a lot of Plato and Aristotle because to me that's a very pivotal moment in history where ideas were just being formed and recorded, and it's of course the birth of modern theater as we know it. And all of this has led me, to a sort of theory that I actually, it's very much embedded in my classes where I teach students how to communicate with sound first and music first, and then we add ideas to it. As opposed to how most plays and most sound happens in plays is somebody writes a play with words, and then you try to find out where the music is, and then you write music to put on top of it. So we approach it the other way around in my class. We learn how to write music, compose music, and emotionally influence people. Then we learn how to attach ideas to it, which of course governments are very concerned about, and that's why we have national anthems and things like that. But they're also very concerned that the wrong message gets attached to music, and off your kids go to some big drug festival in, which brings me to my current project, probably not in the most appropriate way, but I'm also interested, why don't young people go to theater? You go to the theater and it's a sea of, gray hair, but you go to Lollapalooza and Ultrafest and Bonnaroo and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people go, and yet you could take 2 tickets to one of our productions. You couldn't give them away to somebody walking down the street. What's up with that? What is it that's happening in music that's not happening in theater? So at any rate, I put all this together, and so my next production is called Choices. It opens at Mallet Theater on May 2nd and the 3rd, and it's exploration. It's the next step in my exploration of composing music and adding ideas to it. So we came up with a story. A friend of mine developed a story last summer, and then this fall I assembled a team of composers from across the campus. One guy is in molecular biology, the other guy is in aviation engineering, and these guys are 2 of the best EDM composers I've run across on this campus. They've got some pieces. One of them is a pop song that is literally a top 40 hit pop song. And that's a whole long story. I won't tell you more about that. Then I have grad students who are also composers, and we got undergrad students who are also compose EDM. One of them is in interdisciplinary engineering, and another is in electrical and computer engineering technology. And we got together and we created the score and a soundtrack, and we had a big release party earlier in the year at Avidity, and we released the soundtrack. And then I got the rest of the team together, and then we attached all the words to all the music. And so now the next step is to open the production, and it opens in the Mallet Theater. I think I said May 2nd and 3rd. And here's the funny thing: you're all not invited unless you're younger than 30. You would not enjoy this production. There are no seats. You'll have to stand for 2 hours. You're going to be pushed around like you're at a rock concert. And you'll have to stand in line for a half an hour before you get in, and the music will probably be around 100 dB loud, like it is at a rock concert. So you probably aren't going to want to go rushing over and buy tickets to it, but we are hoping that young people will go flock to see it. That's where I'm at now.
Well, Rick, that's some wonderful research that you're doing, and I want to, and I will probably not attend your next production. But let me. We just have a few minutes remaining here, and I want to circle back. You had mentioned students, and all of you on the panel here, you're all known to be very good teachers in our college, and I'd like to hear maybe just a couple of observations or anecdotes about how these interesting research programs spill over into your classroom instruction or your mentoring of students. And why don't we start with Felicia and then just quickly go down the line?
Yeah, I'm thinking sort of 2 things. One of them actually connects right away to Tina when she was talking about Andrew Brightman's project, because it just so happens that there's I'm teaching a Qualitative Methods class where students are learning how to, collect naturally occurring conversation and interaction, or through interviews, and then doing analysis of those in different kinds of ways. And it so happens that a student, he's a communication student, is on that project, and so we're working in this class then to help him figure out ways to sort of analyze from a language perspective some of these ethics, some of this ethics training that they're trying to do. But the other thing that comes to mind is just generally when I teach about the study of conversation, it's called conversation analysis. When I teach about this, is mostly at the graduate level, I guess. I had a student from HTM who wanted to do an examination of menu reading and how people, when they first sit down at the table, go through the whole kind of ritual. Anthropologists might like to look at this too, but the ritual of deciding what to eat.
Who's paying?
And who's paying, and how they read the menu and all that kind of thing.
Well, there are some pauses when the bill comes out too.
So those just sort of come immediately to mind. Maybe as others talk, some other things will come up as well. But those are I love it when I get students in my class from other parts of campus who have different problems that they're working on. And in this case, it happened to be a student who wanted to work on how people do that first discussion of what to get off the menu and who's getting what, and that thing we all know about, and wanted to study that. And I'll do some more thinking.
And Daniel?
So I think there are two tracks for me. One is who I have in the classroom. So I'm really lucky. I've had this last few semesters mostly, I think, a mix of non-political science students. So students from engineering. In fact, this semester I've got nuclear engineers in my classroom, which is quite exciting. And many of my classes involve going out in the communities nearby. One of my classes involves finding conflict over land use, whether it's a roundabout in Carmel, whether it's a new airport being built in Chicago, the Marble Hill nuclear power plants proposed here in Indiana in the 1980s. So having the students go out and interact, not only with the engineering side, but also with the communities nearby, has really shown me the nifty ways that we can bring these together in one teaching setting at the same time.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there to say that, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is, in the STEM fields, they think a lot about laboratory, and they need equipment in their laboratories, and we see tubes and devices and computers and hardware and so forth. And for us, and yours kind of reminds me when you say it, is that for us, we work in a natural laboratory. Our laboratory is the world, and human beings interacting and doing work there. I don't mean we go and manipulate them, but that's sort of my conception anyway of laboratory, and I think that's a nice thing to bring over to the STEM fields. Also, is for them to begin to think about really the world is you don't have to have the lab with tubes and diodes and things, and you just reminded me of that. So thank you.
Great, Kory, any observations, anecdotes, stories?
Yeah, well, so speaking of tubes and diodes, or not that exactly, but I teach a course called Archaeology Materials Science that's cross-listed in Anthropology and Materials Engineering, and there's two main things that we try to accomplish. One is some hands-on, nobody's going to be an expert at the end of one semester, but some hands-on practical experience for everybody involved in looking at artifacts and analyzing it. And so in materials engineering, we've got microscopes, optical microscopes, scanning electron microscopes. We do a very small scale smelting experiment in labs. We do metal casting in labs, and some of these are things that engineering students do. But that's part of the course. The other part of the course, in addition to the hands-on and integrating it whenever we can, is the theory behind technology and innovation, and that's sort of really, I guess, the larger thing I'm interested in. And it's very challenging to bring two groups with very different backgrounds together and try to get them to the same approximate endpoint or level of understanding there. But one of the things that I've found is that this class is all, and I tell students this, I've learned that I need to tell them this at the beginning, that the class is designed to make sure everybody is out of their comfort zone at some point during the semester, most likely multiple times. But we divide the class into lab teams for lab exercises to make sure there's an anthropologist and an engineer, and there may be somebody else on each lab team, so that people have an opportunity to kind of lead and follow, and you can learn from other students. But it's as I've discovered with this course, it's really we have outcomes for the course. You need to have outcomes, but it's really about the process. And I suppose one of the embedded, unstated outcomes is this is practice and working across disciplines as students, whether it's mixed grad and undergrad, and because they're all going to be doing that when they graduate. So.
Neat. Tina, some observations from the classroom?
Sure. So I have the nice opportunity to work with people both in and outside CLA, the College of Liberal Arts, through teaching biomedical ethics, which I'm teaching this semester. And so many of these students are in the biological sciences. They're going to be researchers, doctors, nurses, and this is maybe the one time they get this perspective on what they're doing. So we get to talk about the moral assumptions in a lot of the work they do. For instance, a lot of them work with animals, and perhaps they haven't thought through some of the moral framework for justifying research on animals, doing invasive things to animals for the benefit of humans. And we did a segment on that. Or maybe another example of where these value questions are integral to the work is we talked about disability today, for instance. And can you give a biological, strictly descriptive definition of what it means to have a disability? Or, as many disability scholars noted, is disability understood rather in terms of a social context and how a society accommodates or fails to accommodate someone with a disability? And a lot of them came in with this medical understanding of disability, and I hope left with a broader notion of, a lot of these definitions build in social value into these terms. And so I want them to leave with that broader context, whether or not they have the answers figured out.
Terrific. And now, Rick, I have a pretty good idea already of what it's like to be a student in your class.
Well, you could ask Caleb back there, too. He's already gone no comment.
Well, it's not, no. It sounds like you're doing marvelous work as well, integrating some of your ideas about sound.
Well, I
into
think
the
the
practice of
interesting
teaching.
thing is that we have this really marvelous facility, which is the Sound Studio over in Powell Hall that the university built for our audio, place to get together. And when we designed it, we really did try to design it as a place where multiple disciplines could come together. The one way it differs from how a normal professional recording studio would work is there's all this table space for people to come and sit around and gather and talk and chat. And so it's also a social nexus sort of place where people come together. And because we have students from so many disciplines, around the campus, it allows us to put together students in projects that we will have engineers, technicians, science students mixing in with our artists and composers and musicians, and it creates this sort of synergetic soup that is just extraordinary, and everybody benefits from it. I'm absolutely convinced that having all those different things all focusing on one problem, and you were all touching on it about when this person looks at it from this way, this person looks at it from another way, and you get much more interesting solutions that way when there's a problem that needs to be solved, but you get a lot of different perspectives on it because of the backgrounds they come from. And that's kind of been the synergistic space that this has become, and so we've always encouraged it. We actively try to get as many students from as many different disciplines as we can into our classroom together, and then the nice part about that then is I get to follow them and what they're doing, and they're doing stuff, over in Herrick Labs where I find out about Mark French's guitar classes, and you find out about things that are happening all over the university, and so you get to stay in touch that way through your students.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. This is we're actually past our allotted time here, but you've been most patient. I want to end with just a reminder that tonight there's going to be an event that you won't want to miss, 7:30 in the Loeb Playhouse. There's going to be another panel discussion with nationally known figures in the area of liberal arts and STEM education. This will be moderated by Moira Gunn, who some of you may know. She's the host of Tech Nation on NPR. So please come to that at 7:30. And then finally, I need to thank our panelists for a most engaging discussion. Thank you.